So the Renaissance era actually like a ton happens here. Right at the end of the medieval era, moving into Renaissance, we're starting to see this complete shift in philosophy where the church has driven most of people's thought process, just in terms of everybody followed what the church told them to do. The church was the primary authoritative voice. And now we start to see people saying, well, hey, wait a minute, but I have my own thoughts and feelings and opinions too. What about my individuality? And that sets off this whole musical explosion of creativity. People stop worrying so much about making sure that their music is made in the correct and just way to be performed in church, and they just start making music for fun. And so that split that we started to see in the medieval era, where we're seeing some people doing secular music, some people doing church music, that's now like a huge rift opens up, and we have people that are still composing for the church. In fact, the church is still the primary source of music, but music has become accessible to more than just the church. We see people at home playing instruments. It's no longer just in the church. People are singing and dancing outside of the church now. This is the first time where we start to see people making profit, making a career out of being a musician. We see professional musicians inside and outside of the church. We see amateur musicians everywhere. Everybody feels free to explore music in their own way. The invention of the printing press has a huge effect on composers, because now composers are able to print their music and sell their music as something for other people to perform. Composing suddenly becomes a very lucrative career. So we're starting to see people really make a living off of music, not just using it to worship. A pivotal moment in music history is now that we've hit the Renaissance era, we're incorporating polyphony, which is multiple voices singing at the same time, different notes, maybe even different rhythms. And that is the foundation of the musical forms that we hear both inside and outside the church. Now, inside the church, we're still clinging pretty hard onto a musical form called the motet. And the motet showed up in the later part of the medieval era and is still holding pretty strong in the beginning of this Renaissance era. A motet is a vocal piece where everybody is singing in polyphony, so everybody's singing different parts. And while motets were both sung in and outside of the church, they were really seen as a primarily church-oriented music form. But outside of the church, we start to see this music form called a madrigal. And a madrigal was this secular text, very poetic, that would be sung specifically with melodies that were very singable, melodies that were catchy, and people enjoyed listening to. And madrigals took these secular poems, which are really just poems that don't have to do with the church at all, and they would paint them. They would use music to kind of tell the story that these poems were telling. And madrigals were wildly popular. And very similar to the popular artists we see and hear on the radio today, the artists that sang these madrigals were celebrities. People loved to hear about them, loved to know about who they were. And one of those celebrities is Josquin des Prez. People just knew him by his first name. Like, he was that popular. And this is before media was a thing, so there wasn't like internet or news or even radio to say like, hey, this is who this guy is. Like, he was so famous that people knew his name without having even met him in other countries. Another notable composer is Palestrina. And Palestrina was really responsible for solidifying the form of music and the rules behind it that really became the consistent ideology behind what good music should be. Things like the voice shouldn't leap too often, or if there's dissonance at one point, you should resolve it. Just small rules like that that really came to influence the entirety of what music would become in the future. In fact, that would be what becomes the driving force behind music. Now that music is a source of income, People are no longer just writing for the sake of writing. We're walking away from this primal sound into an intentional desire to make music that people will like, because music that people like sells better. We also see new instruments being created. The flute in today's form starts to appear. We also see the shawm, which is a predecessor to the oboe, and the famous sackbut. That's right, sackbut, which became later on the trombone, which every trombone player I know loves that. We also see more keyboard instruments. We do have the harpsichord, which is my least favorite instrument of all time, because it sounds awful in my opinion, but some people really like it. And we also see the organ, which is my favorite instrument of all time. So, I mean, I guess the Renaissance was good for something. So altogether in this era, we see a complete flourishing of this new ideology. We see people moving away from the pressure of composing only for the church, making names for themselves as musicians and composers, and starting to express parts of themselves that they didn't really feel able to express because it wasn't appropriate to express within the bounds of the church. And this is a rift that we will see down the line just continuing to widen and split into more little rifts. But I'd say this is the era where music really starts to hit its stride. We start to see individuality and expression and creativity in ways that we haven't seen it before. And that makes the Renaissance era vital to the development of music as we know it today.